Okay, folks, here we are for the next lecture. In this second half of the course, we're going to be looking at mostly moral philosophy or ethical theory, and we're going to start off perhaps in an odd place, but only odd from the perspective of a lot of the way in which academic moral theory is presented, not strange from the perspective of Rick and Morty, since we have in Rick a egoist, or at least a kind of egoist, someone that fits that kind of descriptive view, at least, pretty well. So in this lecture, we'll look at a couple of different kinds of egoism, something called psychological egoism, ethical egoism, and a contract theory of morality or political philosophy as well. We'll get more into that later. I am going to start off, however, with something called the immoralist challenge out of Plato's Republic, which kind of helps set up egoism, I think, in a nice way. And again, a way that fits with Rick and Morty pretty well. So let's start with this thing called the immoralist challenge. And it's basically raising the question, why be moral? Right? So here we go with the immoralist challenge. The question, why be moral, is a central question in moral theory, in particular in metaethics. And again, let's take a look at this in order to set up our more detailed discussion of egoism and social contract theory and ethical egoism. So one of the central questions in Plato's Republic, or the central question in Plato's Republic, is what is justice? And of course, Plato and Socrates and Socrates' interlocutors in the dialogue are not particularly concerned with just looking up what we would call a dictionary definition of justice. They're delving more deeply into the issue of what the nature of justice itself. In that book, Plato's Republic, is one of the first main works of moral and political philosophy in Western philosophy. So the central question in that book is what is justice? But as a part of addressing that question, Socrates and some of his interlocutors, his conversation partners and debate partners in that dialogue, take up the question of why be moral, or the immoralist challenge. And so here's how that question gets raised in the Republic. Glaucon, one of the characters, Plato's brother, one of the characters in the dialogue, challenges Socrates to show that that it's rational to be moral, even if you aren't worried about being punished for doing something wrong. And he sets that conversation up with the ring of Gyges. And so the idea here is the ring gives you the power of invisibility. Excuse me. And the Glaucon's myth here sets up the idea, would a just person that puts on the ring continue to be just, or would they become an unjust or an immoral person if they didn't have to fear punishment, right? So here's the myth of Gyges, or the ring of Gyges. Suppose now that there were two such magic rings, again, a ring of invisibility, and the just person put on one of them and the unjust the other. No one can be imagined to be of such iron nature that he would stand fast in justice. No man would keep his hands off what was not his own, when he could safely take what he liked out of the market, or go into houses and lie with anyone at his pleasure, or kill or release from prison whom he would, and in all respects be like a god among men. Then the actions of the just would be the actions of the unjust. They would both come at last to the same point. And this may be truly affirmed to be a great proof that man is just, not willingly, or because he thinks that justice is any good to him individually, nor out of self-interest, in other words, right? But of necessity, of practical necessity, really, is what they're driving at here. For whenever anyone thinks that he can safely be unjust, there he is unjust or immoral. For all men believe in their hearts that injustice is far more profitable to the individual than justice, and he who argues as I have been supposing will say that they are right. If you could imagine anyone obtaining this power of becoming invisible, and never doing any wrong or touching what was another's, he would be thought by the onlookers to be the most wretched idiot. Although they would praise him to one another's faces and keep up appearances with one another from fear that they too might suffer injustice. And so the question that's being raised here, is there a good, rational reason to be moral, even if we don't fear punishment? Is it rational to be moral? Well, much of Socrates' dialogue in the Republic is taking up that challenge. For our purposes, we don't need to delve into that. For our purposes, I just want to use the Ring of Gyges to set up this distinction between self-interest or egoism on the one hand and morality on the other, because for lots and lots of moral theories, those two things are at odds with one another. Morality is often thought to, at least by philosophers, to if there's such thing as an objective and universal morality, it has to be rooted not in one's own personal self-interest, but in either human nature or in universal reason in some way, right? And so why be moral if you have a portal gun? Rick doesn't have an invisibility ring, although it's easy to imagine him inventing one, but he does have a portal gun that basically does the same thing. It is the invisibility ring. It allows Rick to escape the consequences of his actions in one universe and move to another one, or move throughout time and space in the multiverse, such that he doesn't have to fear any kind of punishment from anyone. So is it rational, or is there a good reason for Rick to be moral if he has a portal gun? Well, Rick's answer seems to be, for the most part, no. And insofar as it appears to be no, it looks like Rick is a kind of egoist, right? And so that brings us up to your reading assignment for today, where they talk about Hobbes and the social contract view of political philosophy, Hobbes's particular version of social contract theory. And we're going to use that to talk about egoism, ethical egoism, and contract theory. So here's the second part, the main part of the lecture on egoism and the social contract. So first, let's distinguish two basic types of egoism. One is an empirical thesis, a scientific thesis. It's a psychological or descriptive thesis that says human beings, in fact, only act out of self-interest. That's what motivates them, is their own self-interest. So that's an empirical claim, right? And then there's another kind of egoism, ethical egoism, which is a normative thesis or a prescriptive thesis that says human beings ought to act in their own self-interest. All right, let me point something else out here. Rick, as I note on the slide here, typically acts out of self-interest, but the way that ethical egoism is usually presented as a moral theory is maybe a little bit different than Rick, and so I want to raise this as a potential problem for the view that Rick is an egoist of some kind. And the problem is that while Rick seems to act out of his own self-interest, it doesn't seem, at least much of the time, that Rick is affirming the idea that everyone ought to act out of their own self-interest. Rick should, but he doesn't really care what anybody else does. And so the idea of ethical egoism is not just that I ought to act out of my own self-interest, but that everyone ought to act out of their own self-interest. So it's something we want to keep in mind as we go through this here. And the reason why psychological egoism is important here for both social contract theory, which I'll give you a definition of next, and ethical egoism, is because we want a moral and political philosophy that it at least overlaps with enough of the best parts of human psychology for us to be able to live according to this view. If it's the case that psychological egoism were true, then acting for the interest of others, altruism, would never be possible, and altruism would be a moral theory, a normative or prescriptive theory that suffers from an empirical problem. Because if it's not possible for us to genuinely act out of concern for others, altruistic concerns, then any theory normative theory that says that we ought to do that is doomed from the outset, right? And so, as I mentioned here again, Rick seems to act like an egoist much of the time. In fact, some of our readings have presented that view of Rick, that he's what some people call an objectivist, that is a kind of one version of a philosophy that subscribed to egoism. But again, I want to raise that question for us to think about later about whether Rick is positing that as a universal theory or just what he ought to do. All right, and so then picking up on this notion of psychological egoism, at least, with regard to Hobbes, and there are several different versions of social contract theory. Hobbes is one, John Locke's is another, and they're very different, even though they're both social contract theories. But social contract theory is just the idea, it's one of the main schools of political philosophy that says that the justification of political authority and the basis of society is a contract among individuals. And Hobbes's version of social contract theory says that the reason why people agree to rules of society, either moral rules or political rules, and give up some of their freedom is because it is in their rational self-interest to do so. All right. And so social contract theory or moral contractarianism, sometimes you'll hear the social contract theory taught primarily as a political philosophy, but it's more and more being talked about in terms of moral philosophy as well. And so moral contractarianism is the Hobbesian version of morals by agreement. There are other versions, again, Locke or maybe Immanuel Kant is another theorist that you might see people drawing on for a contract-based morality. But Hobbes's version of this says that human beings will agree to liberty-constricting principles and restrictions on their actions only if it's in their interest to do so, their self-interest to do so, right? And so the idea here for the Hobbesian version is that it's in my rational self-interest to agree to some rules about how to act towards others, right? Because it's in my self-interest to adhere to those rules. Right? As opposed, for example, a Kantian version of contract theory, the rules might be based not in self-interest, but in respect for human dignity or something like this, right? So we're dealing just with the Hobbesian version of this here today. So here's a picture of Hobbes. I'm going to draw some ideas out of his influential work. The Leviathan. Hobbes is often considered one of the fathers of modern moral philosophy because of his contributions to political thought, both in political philosophy and now in moral philosophy as well. And so first, social contract theory kind of has three basic elements. There's the state of nature, which says that the state of nature is just the condition of human beings prior to the formation of any civil society. So in the wild, so to speak. And Hobbes's view of the state of nature is that it's short, nasty, and brutish, as opposed to somebody like John Locke, who thought people were basically cooperative, even in the state of nature. Hobbes has a pessimistic view of the state of nature. We're basically animals running around trying to preserve our own lives. It's chaotic. It's a lot of violence, and so forth. In the state of nature, there's no such thing as justice or morality. Again, a big contrast between somebody like Hobbes and somebody like Locke, on the other hand. We're not going to really deal with Locke very much in this class. I'm just mentioning it as a point of contrast here. And so here's Hobbes on psychological egoism. Hobbes thought this was the correct view. He says, "No man giveth but with intention to good to himself, because gift is voluntary. And of all voluntary acts, the object to every man is his own good, of which, if men see they shall be frustrated, there will be no beginning of benevolence or trust, or consequently of mutual help." Right? So Hobbes is claiming that human beings, in fact, act only out of their own self-interest, and that's the only motivation that human beings really have. Sometimes we might be deluded in thinking that we're really acting for genuine concern out of others, but according to Hobbes, that's just a delusion on our part. We're really being moved to act, as a matter of fact, by our own self-interest. So psychology majors in the room, you probably know that's a controversial thesis on its own. Right? So a little bit more from Hobbes. Why would we agree to these sorts? Why would we agree to a contract? Why would we move from the state of nature and give up some of our liberty and move into a civil society, right? Well, it's because it's easier to preserve our own lives if people agree to some rules. So out of self-interest, right? So he says it's easy It is necessary for all men that seek peace to lay down certain rights of nature, that is to say, not to have liberty to do all that they list, so that it is necessary for man's life to retain some, as right to govern their own bodies, enjoy air, water, motion, ways to go from place to place, and all things without which man cannot live or not live well. Justice, then, is the constant will of giving to every man his own, what they're due. Right? Another way of thinking about that is in terms of desert, right? You should get what you are owed, right? And therefore, there is no own, there is no propriety, there is no injustice, and where there is no coercive power erected, that is to say, where there is no commonwealth, a civil society, a state, there is nothing, nothing is unjust. So that's how I'm saying in the state of nature, there's no such thing as morality. We only get morality once we have an agreement between self-rational self-interested, rational agents, individuals, right? So he goes on here. So that the nature of justice consisteth in keeping of valid covenants, contracts, promises with one another. But the validity of covenants begins not with the constitution of civil power sufficient to compel men to keep them, and then it is also with propriety. It's also there that propriety begins. So the basic idea is that I'll agree to move into the state of nature, from the state of nature into civil society, into a covenant or into a social contract, agreements with others that's the foundation of society, because it's in my self-interest to do so. Instead of running around and worried about someone killing me for my car, we agreed to respect rights of property with each other so that we can each pursue our other goals, our other interests. And so here's a basic argument that you can get out of Hobbes. Let's call this the argument from predominant psychological egoism for moral contractarianism or for social contract theory. Right? So if individuals are predominantly motivated by self-interest to preserve their own lives, and Hobbes thought that the main interest that we all have is self-preservation, then individuals will agree to live according to life-preserving rules. Individuals are predominantly motivated by self-interest to preserve their own lives. That's predominant psychological egoism. Thus, individuals will agree to live according to life-preserving moral rules. In other words, will agree to live by a social contract. So long as other people are doing it too, it makes sense for us to all agree to these certain moral rules, life-preserving moral rules, so that we have social order. Right? And then Hobbes's view in terms of political philosophy was that in order to keep the contracts, in order to keep everybody in line, you needed a strong central government. It's basically a form of authoritarianism. So we get something like that in the Council of Ricks or the Intergalactic Federation. Right? And so here's some key features, excuse me, of Hobbes's social contract theory. I've got 7 of them listed here. So whatever is valuable is whatever a person happens to want. Rational action is action that achieves and maximizes my own wants and desires. It's preference satisfaction or preference maximizing rationality. So that's instrumental rationality, right? Whatever is valuable is whatever I happen to desire, and then reason tells me how to arrange means to achieve those goals. Our primary desire is for self-preservation. Moral action is rational only if it achieves what a person wants. So there's the egoism, right? Morality is a matter of knowing what actions will promote peace and order. So morality is comprised of justifiable constraints on action. What justifies them supposedly here is that it's going to be life-preserving, that it's in my self-interest. So if you could show that morality was not in my rational self-interest, then we'd have a hard time justifying morality according to this view. So peacekeeping actions are egoistically rational when there are social conventions for cooperation. Right? It's easier for you to get what you want if other people have the freedom and liberty to do certain things as well and don't have to worry about their lives being threatened or being killed. If you want to spend all your days playing video games, there have to be other people that have a way of life sufficient for them to be in the business of producing video games. So those conventions comprise morality. That's the basis of morality. And then defining justice or fair treatment of persons is a matter of identifying principles that people could agree to or that they could not reasonably reject, right? Again, out of their own self-interest. And again, in Hobbes's view, in order to keep the contracts, we need the authority, right? The authority figure. And the authority determines what justice is, right? So again, you might have some political concerns there, but that's Hobbes's view, right? And then we have a certain kind of problem that arises for this view. And again, this is illustrated by Rick, because Rick does not buy into the Council of Ricks or the Intergalactic Federation. He considers them a violation, at least of his own liberty, right? And so Hobbes mentions here, in injustice may not sometimes stand with reason, which dictateth to every man his own good. So Hobbes is raising the problem of the fool or the knave. Hobbes used the term fool here, but the knave is a deceptive person, someone who's going to pretend to abide by the contract, but that violates it when they can get away with it with impunity, without punishment, right? And so we see this kind of egoism in Rick. He regularly does immoral things out of what appears to be his own self-interest. So does that show that it's really in my rational self-interest, at least, Rick's rational self-interest, to keep a moral contract, right? And so we can again ask the question here, in terms of the political aspect, in terms of the social contract, in terms of political philosophy or approach to political thinking, do Hobbes's views fit more with Rick or with the Council of Ricks in that way? And so Hummel's article addresses that question a little bit. Let's turn though to a possible criticism of Hobbes's argument, one that attacks the empirical thesis. And here I'm going to use another thought experiment that comes from Joel Feinberg here. And he developed this egoist challenge, right, called, his name's Jones, the character in this thought experiment. But the idea is that he's setting this thought experiment up as a challenge to predominant psychological egoism. So this would be aiming at one of the key premises of that argument that we just looked at for moral contractarianism. All right, so here's the egoist. So imagine a person, Jones, who is first of all devoid of intellectual curiosity. He has no desire to acquire any knowledge for his own sake, and thus is utterly indifferent to questions of science, mathematics, philosophy. Imagine further that the beauties of nature leave Jones cold. He is unimpressed by the autumn foliage, the snow-capped mountains and the rolling oceans. Long walks in the country and skiing forays in the winter are to him equally a bore. Moreover, let us suppose that Jones can find no appeal in art. Novels are dull, poetry a pain, paintings nonsense, and music just noise. Suppose further that Jones has neither the participants nor the spectators' passion for baseball, football, tennis, or any other sport. Swimming to him a cruel aquatic form of calisthenics. The sun only a cause of sunburn. Dancing is coeducational idiocy. Conversation a waste of time. The other sex an unappealing mystery. Politics is a fraud. Religion mere superstition. The misery of millions of underprivileged human beings is nothing to be concerned about. Or excited, it should be excited about, not exited about, but excited about. Suppose finally that Jones has no talent for any kind of handicraft, industry, or commerce, and that he does not regret that fact. What then is Jones interested in? He must desire something. To be sure, he does. Jones has an overwhelming passion for a complete preoccupation with his own happiness. And then the question that Feinberg wants us to consider here is, do you think that Jones, given what Jones is like here in the setup, will be able to satisfy his desire to be happy if he only has a desire for his own happiness and no other desires? So like we've been doing with thought experiments, just take a minute and think about how you would answer that question. You can press pause on the video here and give yourself a minute to do it. And then after you've taken a minute to give your answer to that question, go ahead and hit play again, and we'll go over Feinberg's response. Okay, so hopefully you took a minute and did the thought experiment for yourself. It's just an exercise to get you thinking about this. Here's Feinberg's response. So you can think about whether you agree or disagree with Feinberg's response, and then why. So Feinberg says, it takes little imagination at this point to see that Jones's one desire is bound to be frustrated. People who, like Jones, most hotly pursue their own happiness are the least likely to find it. Happy people are those who successfully pursue such things as aesthetic or religious experience, self-expression, service to others, victory in competitions, knowledge, power, and so on. If none of these things in themselves or for their own sake mean anything to a person, if they are valued at all, then only as a means to one's own pleasant states of mind, then that pleasure can never come. The way to achieve happiness is to pursue something else, other than directly pursuing our own satisfaction. That's the idea here. Almost all people at one time or another in their lives feel pleasure. Some people, perhaps not many, really do live lives which are on the whole happy. But if pleasure and happiness presuppose desires for something other than pleasure and happiness, then the existence of pleasure and happiness in the experience of some people proves that those people have strong desires for something other than their own egoistic, hedonistic happiness. Egoistic hedonism is the view that all that matters is my own pleasure. And so suppose for the sake of argument that Feinberg is correct, and go back to our argument here, which of these premises in this argument from predominant psychological egoism does that thought experiment, if it's correct, aim at? So consider that question it's something to think about in terms of your own studying. Right? So it's clear how Feinberg rejects this argument, right? All right, so that's Feinberg's criticism of egoism. There's a contemporary way of trying to argue for moral contractarianism and social contract theory that doesn't rely on psychological egoism, but again, it makes use of another thought experiment called the prisoner's dilemma here. And I'll just mention it and then pick back up with some stuff related to Hobbes and the issues that are raised in the article that you read for today. So the prisoner's dilemma asks you to consider this scenario and then whether you will cooperate or defect, not cooperate. And cooperate means cooperate with the totalitarian police and testify against, even falsely, the other guy. Right? So take a second and read through this if you need to pause the slideshow here, and then let's take a look at the options. So if you notice, the best outcome for everybody requires both of you to remain silent, not cooperate or confess. That means that both you and Smith would only serve 1 year and then go free. Every time I give this in class, the majority of the class will make a decision that leads to an unoptimistic outcome. In other words, not the best outcome for everybody affected, but what they think is going to be their own outcome, and they end up serving at least 5 years because they're trying to hedge their bets against the other person. But the idea is the other person that this deal has also been offered to is thinking the exact same thing you are, right? So the upshot of the prisoner's dilemma doesn't really seem to help us with regard to social contract theory. In a nutshell, what it shows is this quote mentions here. It teaches us that what we ought to do is violate the moral code or the social contract if we can get away without being punished for it. That's really what is in self-interest. So here we have a problem then for the idea, another problem for the idea that morality could be justified just out of my own self-interest. The prisoner's dilemma, some of the problems involve that it's a one-off decision. Most moral decisions aren't one-off. You encounter the same person over and over again, this sort of thing. And so what the prisoner's dilemma really shows is that although it's set up to provide us with an easy model for understanding complex social situations, what it really shows is that that operating on the prisoner's dilemma in terms of actual morality would lead to work to worse outcomes. Right? That's the basic idea here. All right, and so then some other criticisms of Hobbes's social contract theory here. So one involves that it has kind of a reductive view of human life. Human beings typically want not just to live and survive, but to live a certain kind of life, a flourishing life. And Hobbes's view seems to be rather reductive in that regard. Hobbes also posits extreme individualism, and if there are any anthropology or majors in the room, you know that human beings have never really existed as individuals at first and members of society second, but we've always existed in populations, so there's a bit of a problem with that. We've just talked about the problem with psychological egoism and the problem with the prisoner's dilemma there. And then lastly, it looks like this social contract approach to morality, again, trying to base it on egoism, psychological egoism then, is inadequate for justifying what many thinkers and ordinary people have taken to be the foundation or bedrock of morality, namely the intrinsic value of individuals, each individual's, right? So Rick, for example, doesn't seem to respect anybody's intrinsic value. He uses other people as mere means all the time. So according to contract theories, the idea is, why should I value those who aren't a part of my own contracts, either now or not even potential members of the same contract that I'm agreeing to? So that could be a pretty big problem for Hobbes's view as well. All right, so that's a little bit then on psychological egoism and how it might be used to generate social contract theory, right? Either as a political view or well, in terms of a political view, it's about what justifies political authority. In terms of a moral view, it's about what justifies the terms in which human beings interact with one another, right? The rules that govern our interactions. But there's another view called ethical egoism, right? And this is not just this isn't an empirical or scientific theory about human psychology and what does in fact motivate us. It's the view that we ought abide by our own self-interest. And so this is ethical egoism. It's a normative or a prescriptive theory, not simply a descriptive theory. Again, we've looked at one argument that might be given for ethical egoism or social contract theory based on predominant psychological egoism. And here we'll look at a slightly different argument for ethical egoism as well. This one comes from a thinker you might have heard of named Ayn Rand, who's popular not so much among academic philosophers, but certainly outside of academic philosophy. She's a popular philosopher. She wrote primarily novels, although she did write some essays and stuff like that were nonfiction as well. And so drawing out of her essay, The Virtue of Selfishness, I've reconstructed the Randian argument for ethical egoism here. So I write, the perfection of one's own abilities in a state of happiness is the highest goal for human beings. We have a moral duty to attempt to reach this goal. Premise 2, the ethics of altruism prescribes that we sacrifice our interest and lives for the good of others. Therefore, the ethics of altruism is incompatible with the goal of happiness. Ethical egoism prescribes that we seek our own happiness exclusively, and as such, it is consistent with the goal of happiness. Therefore, ethical egoism is the correct moral theory. So notice this argument doesn't rely on psychological egoism, right? This argument says that we're faced with a choice, either on the one hand pursuing our own self-interest, or on the other hand pursuing the interest of others. Right away, you might recognize a potential problem with that way of starting out, right? Because it looks like kind of a false dichotomy. And so, as I mentioned here, one of the key criticisms of the Randian argument is that it does involve a false choice between radical altruism on the one hand and radical selfishness on the other. It's the case not only theoretically but also practically that we often pursue mutual advantage or common interests, not just my interest versus someone else's interest, right? Another potential problem here is the equivocation fallacy. The equivocation fallacy occurs when we conflate different meanings of the same term in the course of an argument such that it causes a reasoning error. So on the one hand, it looks like the argument conflates self-interest meaning we should promote our own good, but not necessarily at the expense of the interests of others, versus selfishness, sacrificing the good of others for my own good. So a potential worry there. Then these last two objections, the publicity objection and the arbitrariness objection, I kind of flesh out in a little more detail here. So let's take the publicity objection first. And again, this fits very well with Rick and Morty. It fits very well with Rick. Even though this is thought of as a criticism of ethical egoism and a reason that counts against it, it fits very well with the way that Rick behaves. So here I've got a quote about the publicity argument against ethical egoism. So the publicity argument against ethical egoism states that an egoist cannot publicly advertise his egoistic project without harming that very project. In other words, if I run around and tell everybody I'm doing this out of my own self-interest, other people aren't going to cooperate with me. And I'm not going to be able to accomplish that project, because being able to accomplish that project involves getting other people to cooperate with me, at least indirectly. Right? So one of the criteria of a good moral theory is that the moral principle has to be public, right? So the publicity argument against ethical egoism states that the egoist cannot publicly advertise his egoistic project without harming that very project. On the one hand, for something to be a moral theory, it seems necessary that its moral principles be publicized. Right? If I'm going to hold you accountable for behaving in certain ways, or someone's going to hold me accountable for behaving in certain ways, I have to know what the principle is that I'm supposed to be acting according to. Right? So on the other hand, it's not in the egoist's self-interest to publicize them. Thus, it would be self-defeating for the egoist to argue for her position. And even worse, that she should convince others of it. But it is perfectly possible to have a private morality that does not resolve conflicts of interest. The egoist should publicly advocate standards or principles of traditional morality so society doesn't break down, while adhering to a private, non-standard, solely self-regarding morality, ethical egoism. The bottom line for the publicity argument against ethical egoism is that yes, the egoist can secretly hold to her personal moral agenda, moral in quote marks here, but she cannot advertise it without doing damage to her self-interest and to that project. And this restriction counts against the viability of ethical egoism, at least to some extent. And we see Rick do this all the time. Rick regularly lies about or hides his genuine interest. For example, in Anatomy Park, which I have a shot of here, a picture from here, Rick tells everyone that he gives the homeless man dressed up as Santa an annual checkup for health reasons, when really Rick is using that man's body to house his anatomy theme park right inside of him. Publicizing his project there would seemingly undermine that, right? So maybe this is a point in favor of counting Rick as an egoist, because Rick recognizes that being forthright about his own interests would undermine those interests. And then we have another objection that comes from James Rachels in his essay, Ethical Egoism and Moral Skepticism. This is an arbitrariness objection. And so he goes through, in this article, Rachels goes through and says, well, here's what is morally problematic about something like racism or sexism is that it's arbitrary. It says that just based on whether you happen to be a woman or a man or of one race versus another, that because of that, your interests don't count as much as someone else's interests. Right? So ethical egoism is a moral theory of the same type. It advocates that each of us divide the world into two categories of people: ourselves, me versus all of y'all, right? And that we regard the interest of those in the first group as more important than the interest of those in the second group. But each of us can ask, what's the difference between myself and others that justifies placing myself in this special category? And he's talking about what principled way, right? That's what he's getting at. If it's not a principled way, then it's arbitrary, and that's the upshot here. Is it that I'm more intelligent? Do I enjoy my life more? Are my accomplishments greater? Do I have needs or abilities that are so different from the needs or abilities of others? What is it that makes me so special? Failing an answer, it turns out that ethical egoism is an arbitrary doctrine. It's based on my own stake and my own interest, right? Which that's the arbitrariness basis right there. It's just based on my personal whims. In the same way that racism is arbitrary. The argument then is this, and I've again put up the argument for you here. So any moral doctrine that assigns greater importance to the interest of one group or one individual than those of another group is unacceptably arbitrary unless there's some difference between the members of the group that justifies treating them differently. And he's talking about a principled difference, not just one based on personal whim or arbitrary or subjective or relative considerations. Ethical egoism would have each person assign greater importance to his or her own interests than to the interests of others, but there's no general difference between oneself and others to which each person can appeal that justifies difference in treatment. Therefore, ethical egoism is unacceptably arbitrary. And so if that criticism works against ethical egoism, that's would be as close as you're going to get most of the time to refutation, to an actual refutation of an argument, right? So as I've mentioned in the lecture on Introduction to Normative Ethics, if we're going to have a plausible normative theory, then it has to be rooted in principle and not just in our arbitrary and personal convictions, if it's going to be an objective morality. And that's the task of normative ethical theory. It's not just telling me how do I live. It's that the basic task of normative ethical theory is providing a principled, an objective, impartial principle, moral principle to guide conduct, not just for myself, but for everybody. Right? All right, so that wraps up our discussion of egoisms of various types in Rick and Morty. If you have any questions, be sure and put them in the discussion forum, or you can save them for the next live section the next live Q&A session coming up. Hope everybody's doing okay, and I hope to see y'all soon or hear from y'all soon.